One thing that cannot be understated is how difficult it can be for some game franchises to transition from 2D to 3D, as this comes with the trouble of working out what exactly needs to be done for a game's design to translate it into a game with an added dimension on top of the two from before. There have been a number of franchises that have hit it big upon taking the plunge, with Super Mario being a very good example of that. Conversely, Sonic the Hedgehog has had a habit of never really working particularly elegantly in 3D, and those that do tend to make use of traditional 2D elements. It even happened in the realm of what would become the first-person shooter genre. Quake released at a time when real-time polygonal 3D graphics were in their relative infancy, and so the game's combat, compared to Doom, is a touch slower with much fewer enemies to combat in a given level. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, there were a lot of attempts to bring a given franchise into 3D from its two-dimensional roots, and indeed, one such attempt caused quite a stir when it was first announced, chiefly as it would be the first game to release in a moderately popular franchise in almost 10 years. There was some skepticism when the first trailers rolled out, partly because it was too early, but also because it changed the perspective in a way that most feared would affect the tone and atmosphere that had made the previous games as great as they were. However, Nintendo found a new studio to trust with handling their properties and turning them into gold. People were concerned at first, but when the game landed in stores in 2002, it quickly found its way into the heads of those who played it and became one of the games that led to a truly stacked early GameCube library. Games such as Luigi's Mansion, Super Smash Bros. Melee, the Resident Evil remake, and Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem led a charge for Nintendo, and among its ranks was a game that went from side-scrolling action to an explorative first-person shooter, and the change felt completely natural. In 2002, we got a return of our badass bounty hunter in Metroid Prime. Metroid Prime is a first-person shooter adventure hybrid of sorts, published by Nintendo for the GameCube and developed in part by Nintendo R&D 1 over at Nintendo's Kyoto headquarters, but much of the heavy lifting was performed by a newly formed studio in Austin, Texas, called Retro Studios. The team was formed as part of an alliance between Nintendo and Iguana Entertainment founder Jeff Spangenberg. Iguana Entertainment were responsible for developing quite a few noteworthy games for the Nintendo 64 back in the day, perhaps most famously the Turok series. Spangenberg was a self-taught programmer who opted to skip college to pursue a career in that field, forming development studios to release a great many games. But following publisher Acclaim's takeover of Iguana Entertainment, he was fired from his leadership position, although he sued Acclaim on the basis of breach of contract and fraud, settling the case in 2000. In the meantime, there was some game making to be done. He had reached out to Nintendo to form a studio in his new home of Austin, Texas, having moved Iguana Entertainment from Santa Clara, California, due to the ever-increasing expenses in operating out of Silicon Valley. Retro Studios would thus be formed in September 1998, and despite not having access to development kits for the GameCube at first, they would still develop an engine as well as some game concepts to test out whether they had something worthwhile. The team developed 4 prototypes, all of very different genres. One was an American football game called NFL Retro Football, familiar territory for the ex-Iguana folks, but when EA and 2K started porting their NFL games to the GameCube, it became redundant and was cancelled. The next was a game that went by the working titles of Thunder Rally and Car Combat. Quoting from Wikipedia here, it was initially pitched to Nintendo as a mix of Quake World, Twisted Metal 2, and Mario Kart 64, with shades of Mad Max and Street Fighter 2. A lot of work was done, but again, the project was cancelled. An action RPG was also in development called Raven Blade. It was even showcased at E3 in 2001, but development was fraught with technical problems that couldn't be overcome, and the game was shelved. There was one project that initially didn't get far beyond concept stages, mostly art and some assets, as well as a simple first-person engine demonstration. It was an action-adventure title, based on the working title of the project. As part of one of his regularly scheduled meetings with the folks at Retro, Shigeru Miyamoto had a look at the work that had already been done with it so far, and based on what he had seen, he was inspired by it and advised that Retro should develop a Metroid game based on the concepts behind the action-adventure game they had previously shelved. After getting the go-ahead from Miyamoto, and after Nintendo granted the team the license to develop a Metroid game, Metroid Prime's development went full steam ahead. But the process was not a smooth one, as many members would recall. Regular internal delays, a lot of deliberating on how the level should be designed, and eventually running up the clock to midnight, as well as problems concerning Jeff Spangenberg himself, it's fair to say that the development process was difficult. Towards the end of development, the team were crunching to ensure the game was ready for its launch in November, working as many as 80 to 100 hours per week. It became a truly brutal process, and nobody was even sure if Miyamoto's blessing was even enough. The initial reaction to Metroid Prime's reveal at E3 was mixed, particularly from the perspective of gameplay. The idea of a Metroid first-person shooter sat weirdly with some, perhaps understandably, and it took time to allay any concerns they may have had. In the end, however, Metroid Prime released to critical acclaim across the gaming world, selling 2 million units and being recognised, in the nearly 20 years since its release, as one of the greatest games ever. The gamble had undoubtedly paid off for both Nintendo and Retro Studios. So with all of this in mind, I think it's about time that we have a look at the game to see just what made it tick all the way back in 2002. As ever, of course, we will start by taking a look at the packaging, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about GameCube game packaging in general. Traditionally, Nintendo have had unique or otherwise unusual packaging proportions for their games, and whilst this isn't entirely unique to Nintendo, their packaging tends to differ a lot across the board compared to other companies. As an example, Sony PlayStation games tended to come in the various CD cases of the time, from the common dual case designs to even the long box style cases some of the earlier titles released in. Also common was the slightly larger dual case style of packaging, chiefly to accommodate thicker manuals. As the PlayStation 2 went towards using DVDs alongside CDs for its games, Sony opted to use a simple polybox case, although with one main difference, in that it had a space to put a memory card in most of the cases. Much later games would omit that and use thinner plastic. Why am I talking about this? Well, this is where I bring the PAL version of Metroid Prime for the GameCube, which, like most games of its vintage, was sold in polyboxes. Again, this has the difference of being made to accommodate a smaller GameCube disc and a memory card. And now I'll compare it with the Japanese packaging to show you just how tiny the Japanese GameCube game boxes are. The boxes, which are 106mm wide and 148mm tall, contain virtually everything, whilst trimming the fat of the larger boxes of other territories and other systems. The boxes are also constructed in a very different way, where a bracket holds the manual and other papers, and based on the 5 games I own, the boxes are all clear, allowing you to show the manual through the box, unless you leave the cardboard sleeve on. So what of Metroid Prime's packaging specifically? Well, suffice it to say, I think it looks great. We see Samus Aran in a pose suggesting motion and strength, and she has tremendous presence on the cover. The game's logo, located off-center and towards the bottom, allows for Samus to breathe, as though it's not the logo that's trying to catch your attention, but rather Samus herself. After all, Samus's appearance is iconic, so it makes sense in focusing on her. The PAL and NTSC box arts use a more stationary looking Samus, but the effect is still pretty strong, in that she appears as the focal point. You get to play the role of a strong, focused bounty hunter investigating what is going on around here. The back of this box is also pretty good. It is densely packed with stuff, including yet another cool pose from Samus Aran, as well as some screenshots sandwiching the text and Samus. There are 8 screenshots on the back here, showing off a series of things that will show up during the game. Whilst the screenshots are on the slightly smaller side, they still carry a good level of detail, allowing someone picking up the game to see what to expect. There's also an extra thing here mentioning a cable designed for a Game Boy Advance and linking it to the GameCube that way. We'll explain that later on. I won't be making any use of it myself, but I can explain what is going on there. As we slip the sleeve off the case and open it, we find the game disc off to the right, a bunch of papery guff on the left, consisting of a manual, a piece of paper explaining best practice with cleaning the game disc, as well as a fold-out pamphlet which advertises both Metroid Prime and Metroid Fusion, which released around the same time for the Game Boy Advance. On the inverse is... well, it looks like I'm explaining this whole thing now. Basically, connecting a Game Boy Advance with Metroid Fusion in it to a GameCube with Metroid Prime in it allows you to unlock content. Depending on which of the two you have beaten first, you can unlock the Fusion suit for Metroid Prime, or play the Famicom Disk System version of the original Metroid, complete with the save slots that the West wouldn't get because Nintendo thought that batteries were too expensive back then. Anyway, before we ruin any more secrets in this game, we're going to dive into the manual and talk about a few things in it. Like the back of the box, this manual is densely packed with stuff, and it's laid out in a way I like. The manual goes into rather extensive detail to describe exactly what the player can expect to see while playing this game, and it does a great job of showing off how the controls work for this game, provided you can read the language. Don't worry, there are some breadcrumbs in-game, as I'll explain later. Even if some things in this manual might be obscure due to the language problems, the manual still does a respectable job of allowing players to understand what to expect from this game when playing it. Speaking of, let's not waste any more time and start playing. Before we actually begin, as with every GameCube game that has the ability, I will be playing this with progressive scan enabled. I'll explain what this is about later. I'm going to be doing a lot of explaining about relatively simple things. Anyway, as we load up, we are greeted by a start screen which loads into... some really bad scanline effects, or what? I guess this is just an accidental effect of running this game in progressive scan, but for what it's worth, it's not too much of a problem, given how little we actually see this. Anyway, we select a save slot to start the game up in, and we are thrown right into an introductory cutscene with some dialogue from an off-screen voice.
The cosmos. In the vast universe, the history of humanity is but a flash of light from a lone star. The life of a single person should be lost in space and time. But among the stars, there is one light that burns brighter than all others. The light of Samus Aran. Her battles extend beyond her life and etch themselves into history. Here, another chapter of that history will be written.
Moments later, a ship starts hovering around a seemingly destroyed space station as it comes around to prepare to dock. As it does so, Samus Aran emerges from the top of the ship to make an entrance, jumping from the ship and onto the platform of the station. Once the camera positions itself into Samus's head and activates the heads-up display, we can take control of her and find the controls to be unorthodox for a first-person shooter, or at least compared to what the emerging standard would be. You're probably more familiar with how most first-person shooters control these days, where the left analog stick controls your forward, backward and sideways movement, with the right analog stick controlling the camera. In this game, however, Samus moves more akin to a tank, in that the left stick controls forward and backward movement, but left and right on the stick turn you in that given direction. You're probably wondering how you look up or down or even strafe, and this is where we get into the controls regarding combat. Pressing the A button fires a shot from your arm cannon, holding it down allows you to charge a more powerful shot, and the Y button fires a missile. The shoulder buttons also have their own utility in that the left shoulder button locks onto a target or otherwise locks Samus's view to allow you to strafe, and the right shoulder button locks Samus in place and allows you to move the camera with the analog stick. So what do you do with the C stick then? Well, that's for later, you don't have to worry about that for now, but the D-pad allows you to change visors. You start out with a combat visor, you can guess what that does, and the scan visor to scan things like enemies and environmental effects for a variety of purposes. Throughout this section of Metroid Prime, you will find yourself exploring the station, opening a variety of doors by shooting them open, attacking and possibly scanning the many creatures you'll find within, and using things like the morph ball to roll through conveniently sized tunnels. You can eventually find yourself using a few things that will be more common at later points in the game, notably map station rooms, where you will be given a solid chunk of an area to look at on the map screen via the Z button, and save station rooms, allowing you to save your progress and refill your energy. Eventually you'll find yourself making your way to the game's first boss, the Parasite Queen. It's a relatively simple boss that goes down fairly quickly, but it teaches you a few things about this game and how its bosses are going to work. Movement is key in this game. Always be on the move and make regular shifts in direction, vertically and or laterally. Keeping locked on is also pretty important, but more important than that, you need to keep an eye on what the enemy does. Probably the best idea of what to expect with this boss is when it charges up a green laser-like attack, which can do a little bit of damage, but nothing so severe that it's unsurvivable. And eventually, your attacks defeat the Parasite Queen, but because of its dying frenzy, the station's self-destruct sequence initiates. You have a few minutes to make your way out of the station as quickly as you can, making sure whole groups of enemies can't impede you, and making sure the little things don't get in your way. You'll eventually find Ridley, who looks a little different to how he did in the original game, as he starts breaking things and eventually escaping. Samus then decides to show some amount of emotion by scowling in her helmet, but eventually we return to making our way out of the station. That is, until we end up scanning one particular panel that allows us to use an elevator. As we do that, things explode behind us and Samus gets thrown to a wall, seemingly damaging her suit to a point where her suit, weapons and abilities are severely pared back. No more grapple beam, no more charge beam, no more missiles, no more morph ball, and no more morph ball bombs. Even your suit is downgraded from the Varia suit to your standard power suit, so no bulky shoulder pads for you anymore. This feels horribly contrived. They had Ridley appear on screen for a few seconds, but they didn't do anything with him of note, while Samus gets thrown around a bit by an explosion and all of a sudden her suit decides to be useless? This is only marginally less bad than how Castlevania Symphony of the Night did it, where it just didn't even bother trying. Death just took your weapons and grounded you for being naughty. In any event, we find ourselves running out of the station with our tail kinda tucked between our legs, as Ridley flies down towards the planet, which the station is on a crash course towards, Samus giving chase until she loses track of him. Samus eventually breaks into the atmosphere of the planet Tallon IV, before coming into land in an open area, lush and verdant, rainy and tropical. Now that Samus has made Planetfall, she must now recover her lost abilities and begin her hunt for Ridley. Beginning to get to grips with Metroid Prime requires not just getting used to the unusual control scheme, but also getting used to the game effectively dropping you onto a planet that you have no idea about yet, so you'll want to get cracking. As things start, you'll be exploring a relatively small parcel of certain environments so as to not scare you off through getting lost. As the game progresses, however, where you go and where you can go opens up a lot. This is the design philosophy that Metroid as a series has refined over the years. Whilst the original game had trouble with getting you going in the right direction, later games would make it much harder to get lost earlier on, with Metroid Prime basically working in a similar way to how Super Metroid worked. The environments you tackle throughout the game are strongly varied in appearance, tone and wildlife. One moment you're exploring the hot lava-filled Magmor caverns, and the next moment you're in the glacial Phendrana drifts. Each location has a distinct appearance to help with making sure you understand where you are, and the layouts are designed in such a way that you'll usually find yourself going from A to B without getting horribly lost by accident due to mistaking one room for another. The game starts you off in the Tallon overworld, a location that seems to have eternal rainfall, with a lot of greenery and vegetation to keep the fauna happy and crawling around. You don't explore much of it at first, but it eventually opens up much later as you find alternative entrance points and different nooks and crannies. The other area you explore in the voyage to get your lost equipment back is the Chozo ruins. Arid and bereft of the eponymous bird-like creatures, it feels like an environment that once held such life. Given the machinery that is still present, but some events saw it come to an end somehow. There are a few more areas we can talk about, but I think it's best to save those for later, as this part of the game is focused squarely on the quest to return to the state you were in before the game decided to take your lunch money back on the station. In this part of the game, you usually have to go through some sort of process in order to acquire a given item, be it defeating an enemy or series of enemies, or unlocking doors that require you to scan some lock plates. Not all pickups are like this, as it would probably be a bit excessive for most missile pickups to be quite this involved, but generally speaking, this is how things are for new weapons and abilities. Some new weapons and abilities can take a couple minutes due to how involved the process of getting them can be, with some later items like the plasma beam requiring you to use the spider ball an awful lot, but the general process isn't usually anything annoying or excessive. As has already been ascertained, this game is played from the first person perspective, although you leave it when you're in morph ball mode, otherwise you'd probably want a chunder bucket to make sure you don't throw up absolutely everywhere. Personally, this is a design choice that I think helped the game in the end. I'll go into further detail about how it affects the atmosphere later, but playing through the eyes of Samus in a mostly literal way does wonders for the game. The controls also work really well for the game. They may seem a little on the idiosyncratic side at first, but they don't take long to get used to at all, and it almost feels natural after a while. Combat is slightly slow in terms of pace, think of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time or Quake for a similar example, but that's not too much of a concern for what the game is going for. Metroid Prime is what an onlooker may refer to as a first-person shooter, and by all accounts it's how I refer to it as well, but historically its increased focus on puzzle solving and exploration left people suggesting that it would be better to refer to it as a first-person action-adventure game instead. Personally, I think this somewhat nullifies the emphasis on combat, which, considering how the game is structured, is a bit bizarre to me. Combat is quite a crucial part of progress in the game, certainly no less than scanning and puzzle solving, and indeed, some bosses themselves are puzzles in a way. In saying that, I can see someone making the argument that the increased focus on exploring and solving puzzles makes the first-person shooter identifier either insufficiently representative of the game as a whole, or missing the point of the game in the sense of it omitting the aforementioned elements that sets Metroid Prime apart from others of its ilk in a way. The following is an example of why this is a somewhat contentious point, and it's primarily to do with the inclusion of a scan visor in Metroid Prime. In order to scan something, select the scan visor by pressing right on the D-pad, and while you won't be able to use your weapon in this mode, locking onto a targeting icon will allow you to scan and learn about or interact with that thing. Throughout this game you can scan many things you come across to learn about that thing or derive log entries from either the Chozo who resided on the planet originally, or the space pirates who commandeered it for their own ends. Now in the version that I'm playing, it's virtually useless for reading up on the lore behind this game's story, owing to the fact that this is in Japanese and my reading comprehension is somewhat limited in that language. I swear I'm working on it. However, alongside a percentage rating for item procurement, there's also a percentage rating for scan data, and depending on your scan percentage, you could unlock some cool things in the menu. I didn't bother though, there isn't much of a point for me. That's not the only use for scanning, however. There are a ton of things in the world that require you to scan them as a means of interaction, chiefly electronic panels that can be used to activate transport elevators, deactivate force fields, and so on. You also have a vast wealth of flora and fauna to have a look at. Scan to your heart's content and learn about the biology and physiology of, say, war wasps, because we needed those blighters round here. I have enough of the little bastard outside my window! The scan visor isn't the only visor in this game though. There are a few visors to use in this game, and while you start off with 2 of them, you also get another 2 as you progress through the game. Whilst you find your way through the Pirates Research Facility in Phendrana Drifts and discover some horrors hanging around the facility, you eventually make your way to a tall room with something held below behind a few shields that you need to deactivate. Once you've done that, you can acquire the Thermal Visor. It comes into effect virtually immediately as the facility goes dark and you need to be able to see the enemies, and the Thermal Visor can highlight things that are temperate, like, say, life forms. The other visor comes in quite a bit later in the game, and it's another one that comes in useful pretty much instantly. although more out of necessity due to not really being otherwise able to get out of the location you're exploring. In an area of Tallon Overworld, you will find yourself in a small chamber with a visor you can pick up, it being the X-ray visor. You can't do much else in the room, however, unless you use the X-ray visor to find out that there's more to this room than just this little chamber. The X-ray visor is designed to see things that are otherwise obscured or invisible to you, as well as keeping track of things that you previously couldn't, most prominently the Chozo ghosts that you start to encounter in later visits to the Chozo ruins. Throughout Metroid Prime, you'll make use of these visors to ensure your progress goes smoothly as you play through the game. The nature of the game makes it so that you'll want to use these tools to have a look for things that seem out of place according to them, or to see if the scan visor suggests there is something afoot. It's important, therefore, to understand what each of the visors do and how they work. Given you're playing from the perspective of Samus herself, it will serve you well to experiment with how the visors work and try to look for given things through them. For example, the thermal visor will usually allow you to differentiate warm-blooded creatures from either neutral or cold surroundings, but in an area where there are substantial sources of heat, you won't get the same benefit. You also don't want to be using the thermal and X-ray visors too much as you navigate, given how you won't be able to distinguish colour coding on doors, unless you just go off of memory. Which reminds me, I should talk about the interface for this game and how it all works in the context of Metroid Prime, because this is one of those interface design concepts that I actually genuinely love. Starting at 12 o'clock, we have Samus's energy at the top, a minimap in the top right, a missile counter to the right, your different beams in the bottom right, your different visors in the bottom left, an environment alert to the left, and a radar in the top left for nearby creatures. In the centre is the targeting reticle, and all of this is surrounded by the inside of the helmet as though you were looking out of Samus's own helmet. You can of course go into the options menu to make the surrounds less opaque, or even completely transparent if you prefer. It should also be noted that the different visors have their different layouts, but the general premise is the same: energy at the top, missiles to the right, environment warnings to the left, and so on. With the scan visor, you can look for a target on the entity you're wanting to scan, and it will either show up orange or red depending on the nature of what it is you're scanning, and if you've already scanned it, the target will be dimmed out. With the scan visor, things can be a little iffy in that you have to find a target that is a part of the entity you want to scan, and it's not always easy to find it. Sometimes the size of the entity can obscure it. You could argue that I'm saying this out of hindsight, given the improvements later games would make to the scan visor. However, this is something I felt when I first played this game back in around 2010, as I had trouble finding some scan targets. With that in mind, I think it's worth going over the various weapons you accrue in your time playing Metroid Prime, and there are a fair few of them. You get 4 beams, each of which can be charged, or you can use missiles, or even use missiles in tandem with a charged beam to fire a charge combo if you have it. The 4 beams you get are your standard power beam, and in order of acquisition, the wave beam, the ice beam, and the plasma beam, with each of the 4 beams having their own unique effects and uses in and out of battle. Your power beam is the basic, simple, old faithful sort of weapon. It's not very powerful on its own, but it has a major benefit in that it can be spammed pretty much as quickly as you can mash the A button, which can be useful for certain situations. The wave beam is a more powerful but slower firing weapon which, when charged, can be used to stun enemies in place, making them vulnerable. It can also be used to power conduits, as seen through the thermal visor. The ice beam is a slow weapon to fire, but one that allows you to freeze enemies in place, especially if you charge it up and follow it up with a missile to destroy your opponent with ease. It can also be used on some fire jets in the Magmor caverns to disable them temporarily. Lastly, the plasma beam is a very powerful and very spicy weapon indeed, capable of melting ice and burning enemies to a cinder, damaging them over time. If you charge the weapon up, you can completely incinerate an enemy with ease. The charge combos are a little on the weird side, however. The super missile that you get early on, combining 5 missiles with a charged power beam shot, is a very solid powerful attack that can take care of a good number of enemies in one fell swoop, or 2 in the case of the Chozo ghosts. Others are a little spotty. The Plasma Beam's flamethrower is, much like most flamethrowers in games, pretty much useless owing to its poor range, and in this case it's very expensive to run as it drains missiles as you use it. The Ice Spreader, which consumes 10 missiles in a shot from a charged ice beam, can be useful for freezing a group of enemies, and it has some degree of an area of effect, but otherwise I don't tend to see much use for it. Really, the only one I used to any degree beyond the super missile was the Wave Buster. It drains missiles like the flamethrower does, but it hits anything you point it at, stunning them and damaging them progressively. It's kinda fun to use, but you'll feel buyer's remorse for needlessly using all those missiles. With that aside, you get the weapons you can use in Morph Ball mode, namely the Morph Ball Bomb and the Power Bomb, and they both fit very different roles. The standard bomb is a simple attack that you use more for traversal than for offense or defense, although you do still use it for that purpose in a pinch. It doesn't deal much damage, but it's sufficient for the job. You can only lay down 3 at a time and they take a moment to regenerate. The Power Bomb is a whole other kettle of fish. It's highly damaging, doing damage for each frame that it is active, and has a sizable blast radius. It also uses its own ammunition, with an expandable stock and ammo dropping from enemies somewhat frequently. Armour is also a key part of things. You start out the game with the Varia suit, before it gets taken away because of contrived nonsense, and it returns you to a no-frills power suit. It protects you semi-sufficiently, but you want bigger and better. The Varia suit is that bigger and better thing. Its most important property is extreme temperature resistance. You can explore superheated rooms with no immediate concerns. It doesn't stop you from taking damage from dipping your toes into magma, however, and you move through water like it's treacle. The latter is where the gravity suit comes in. It allows you to move through water like it wasn't there, providing you with access to certain crucial locations, such as the sunken frigate in Tallon Overworld. There is one other suit you can get, but we'll get to that later. Oh, and each suit comes with the bonus of damage reduction, increasing in degree for each suit you get. So it's not just about having the abilities, but also the enhanced protection of those armours. Suffice it to say, there's a lot to play with here. You have a solid array of tools at your disposal, and the way you use them in battle is up to you. Just know that certain enemies are best taken down via certain methods, and you'll learn this in the Phazon mines especially. The Phazon mines are the part of the game where you start delving into one of the big things in the Metroid Prime trilogy, Phazon. It plays a key role in a number of the situations you encounter, as well as affecting a number of enemies you fight. In universe, Phazon is a highly mutagenic substance with tremendous energy producing capabilities, things that the space pirates sought to take advantage of. Phazon's presence on Tallon IV came about due to some form of meteor crashing into the planet which started spreading its poison. The enemies you encounter in the Phazon mines have, to some degree, been subjected to severe testing and experimentation, from Metroids that are much more resilient to the space pirates themselves, as is the case with the Elite Pirates and later the Omega Pirate. The Phendrana Drift's boss, Thardus, is also an example of this experimentation. Phazon-infused non-organic matter that became sentient and powerful. Extraordinarily powerful at that, to such an extent that it had to be contained within a large dome to prevent further collateral damage. Phazon itself is a dangerous substance. You have no immediate resistance to it, and if you make contact with it, your health will go down at a gradually increasing rate, meaning you will want to be especially careful with where you go. The Phazon mines also has quite an amount of it just littering the place. Pools of the blue poison can be seen all around the area, especially in the lowest level where you need to reach the Omega Pirate. It's also really dark in some parts, making it difficult to see with anything other than the thermal visor, where you will see just how potent it is as a substance. In fact, in lore, it's said to be more like an organism, somewhat like a fungus, constantly spreading and manipulating anything it touches. To break away from Phazon itself though, the Phazon mines are quite tough. I remember on my first playthrough of Metroid Prime over 10 years ago having a tremendous amount of difficulty, and it comes down to one major thing. Throughout most of the game, save points are relatively frequent and you're never usually too far away from one. In the phase on mines, however, the gap between the one near the entrance and the next one is so far that it's actually weird. Looking over the footage, it took me roughly 24 minutes between using the first save point at the start of the mines to using the second one connected to the room where you get the power bombs. It's really strange to me how they stretched it that far. It doesn't sound like a lot, but compared to the previous time we went to a space pirate facility, it leans towards the severe side. The longest gap in Phendrana Drifts, for example, was closer to 20 minutes. Still a fair while, but it didn't start to feel too concerning. It also doesn't help that the enemies can barrage you in corridors filled with obstructions. It can make this section of the game a bit stressful in fact, and I don't recommend playing through this part of the game until you have a decent amount of equipment at your disposal. Throughout virtually every turn here, you have a lot of stuff to take care of, simply because if you don't take care of it, it will take care of you. It's unrelenting, much like how the research facility in Phendrana Drifts was, except that area afforded you a save point with gaps no longer than 20 minutes between use. There's another problem with the phase on mines, its reliance on platforming, more so than most other areas of the game. This game's platforming is, compared to the 2D games before it, awkward for the most part. Thankfully, the developers planned for this being the case, and so platforming doesn't tend to be much more than jumping up or down to other places. Really, the bulk of the platforming is just simple stuff that's not too brutal, honestly. There are times, like in the Sunken Frigate, where you'll need to jump forward and backward, and the penalty in that particular location is actually somewhat severe if you slip off of one of the platforms. Going up and down again is pretty brutal in that place. We'll get to a couple other things in this game when the time is right, but for now I want to divert to the presentation within Metroid Prime. This is going to be a pretty heavily stacked section because by and large, Metroid Prime is one of those games with some of the best presentation I've seen. I'm going to start primarily with the visuals. This game released in 2002, a year after the GameCube's launch, and for the time, this game has some really good visuals. The technical stuff out of the way first though. It runs at 60 frames per second very smoothly, and outputs at 720 by 480 resolution, with the option to run in progressive scan on startup if you have something in the digital out, like my GCHD Mark II. Interestingly, whilst this game's output is 720 pixels wide, the actual in-game resolution is more like 660 pixels as standard. You can, however, change that to be anywhere between 640 and 680 pixels wide. And I've gone with the latter, and it still plays solidly smoothly, albeit with occasional slowdown in instances where things get hectic. As for how things look, it's less a matter of texture or material quality, and more a case of impeccable art direction that this game has across the board. It doesn't matter how good your graphics are, if the art style is ugly and unwelcoming to look at. Many of the textures themselves look alright, if occasionally ordinary, but that's how games tended to look back in the early 2000s, with the advent of more advanced graphics processors that allowed for a game to look ever so slightly more realistic than previously. Instead, the game's visuals are made to look more impressive due to a combination of well-designed models and visual effects, the latter of which proves to be crucial for this game, as without them, the game's atmosphere would be so much flatter. Each entity has plenty of polygons to it, giving even small creatures a lot of detail. Fairly large creatures also benefit from this by looking particularly organic, complete with some smooth animations. They're generally really solid in terms of visual appearance. The effects are still the star of the show though. When Metroid Prime came out, it's hard to think of games that had quite the attention to detail this had. Maybe Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, but a lot of the details are more ornamental and out of the way than anything that makes you think, wow, this is pretty cool. Droplets of rain on your visor as you look up to the sky in the Tallon overworld, the visor steaming up as you walk by steam or in hot and humid environments, and Samus's face reflecting in the visor after a bright flash of nearby light or a shot from your arm cannon. There's a lot of detail here. The different beam weapons have different arm cannon arrangements too, not just colours, with the beam logos being represented by hand gestures. It's simply great to look at. There is also the audio side of things, and by all accounts this game sounds great. I'll go into some detail concerning the soundtrack in a bit, but for the moment let's talk about Metroid Prime's sound design first, as this is where some of the truly good stuff lies. Much of the game's sound design was handled by Clark Wen, a big fan of Metroid growing up, seeking to recreate the atmosphere of the earlier games, and by all accounts, he did a stellar job of achieving what he set out to do. If there's one thing the Metroid franchise is big on, it's atmosphere. Games like Metroid Fusion are very good examples of how big a deal atmosphere can be for the series, and for an example of how it can be somewhat damaged, Metroid Prime 3 is a fairly decent one, but that can wait. Audio is layered on really beautifully. The sounds of machinery, small critters, big critters, plant life and other natural and even unnatural happenings have a quality to them that enhances the atmosphere incredibly well by sounding like it belongs. The game also makes use of sound to help players understand their surroundings. The main use for this lies in the sounds that items make when you're near them, indicating that you might want to look into getting it somehow. The best thing about the game's audio, however, is the soundtrack. This game's soundtrack was composed by longtime Metroid composer Kenji Yamamoto, with assistance from Koichi Kuma. Note, this Kenji Yamamoto is not to be confused by the Kenji Yamamoto known for his work on Dragon Ball, and for plagiarism. Anyway, if there's one thing music does for this game, it's to amp up the atmosphere and give the audio something to work alongside. The music in Phendrana Drifts is cited as one of Metroid's best pieces of music, and the music on Tallon Overworld early on in the game sets you up for what's to come just beautifully. There are even a few pieces that aren't even music in the traditional sense. You will encounter these in areas infested with space pirates, such as the Phazon mines. It helps to make the area feel more atmospheric and dreadful. It's really good. Also a part of the audio in this game, albeit somewhat subdued, is voice acting. Now, you might be thinking, why does this game need voice acting when there's not really anyone to communicate with? Well, that's the thing. In Metroid Prime, the voice acting is mainly limited to Samus's grunts upon being hit, and the guy who narrates the opening and ending parts of the game, as well as the location names for whenever you load the game up. You can probably argue easily that some of this is superfluous and unnecessary, but in the case of Samus herself, whose voice work is performed by acclaimed voice talent Jennifer Hale, it all adds to the atmosphere the game has in a way that's meaningful and impactful. The game net benefits from it, I'd say. There are also different music themes for a number of different battles in the game, like the boss fights. And this is where I go into something I'm not so fond of with this game: the boss fights. Boss fights are, historically, very difficult to get right in first-person games. Many first-person shooters don't often get them right, with some even electing to forego boss fights entirely, which, in some respects, can be argued as being the smarter option. Nonetheless, Retro Studios gave it a try, and by all accounts they're better than most boss fights in first-person shooters I've encountered, but also they're not really anything to write home about. They're rather ordinary as fights go. Retro Studios did at least go through the effort of making the boss fights work in the context of the game's lore, justifying why Flagra has retractable sun mirrors in the arena, and why Thardus is a sentient pile of rocks. In that sense, there was some thought put into these battles. The bosses have simple patterns that you need to observe and counter, and there'll usually be some sort of gimmick, like Flagra's arena consisting of mirrors you need to retract to subdue it before you bomb it. To be honest, better that it's too easy than too hard, all things considered. Saying that, you may be somewhat lost on how to defeat bosses if you don't scan them. And since I'm playing the Japanese release, that is invariably going to consist of text that many won't really be able to read or understand in any meaningful way. Some bosses do feature lock-on points that activate immediately after scanning, like the Parasite Queen, but don't rely on this mechanic as it doesn't often appear and doesn't tell you the full story as far as defeating the bosses is concerned. One thing I will say, however, is that this game handled Meta Ridley poorly. The start of the game showed Meta Ridley in the frigate that's about to crash towards the planet, but for whatever reason, you lose all your abilities thanks to a couple explosions, rather than Ridley just grabbing you and throwing you or something. The eventual boss fight with it isn't much better either. After something I'll explain in a few minutes, you find your way to the impact crater's entrance and Ridley appears to destroy the statues and make passage impossible, meaning you have to fight him. And the fight is mediocre. There's a lot of build up for this fight, yet the payoff is honestly not all that. Between Meta Ridley in Prime and Ridley in Super, I'm far more threatened by the latter because at least it's more of an onslaught than constant stopping and starting, for the first form especially. You need to wait until he's stopped in order to be able to attack him. Most of the time, however, you're waiting a while for him to actually get into a position where you can attack him, and it can take 30 seconds for that to happen. That doesn't sound like a lot, but the time adds up as the battle goes on, and for much of the time, you're pressing the R button down to lock onto him. Not only that, but you're hopping around avoiding projectiles and lasers, and it's not great. The second phase isn't much better. After melting his wings, you fight Meta Ridley on the ground, and you need to stun him in place and shoot out his chest. It's honestly underwhelming as a boss fight, and it doesn't feel like a proper encounter with him. The other thing I'm not really a big fan of in this game is the artifact hunt, or what I'm almost inclined to refer to as the MacGuffin hunt, because this is something that is absolutely necessary to reach the final area of the game, and I'm not sure I like this. For context, in prior games, I'm going to cite Super Metroid in particular here, you would have to defeat certain bosses in order to unlock the final area of the game, and along the way you'll pick up the necessary items to make the final part viable. In Metroid Prime, the bosses you beat and the keys to the lock are almost entirely disconnected. The artifact hunt starts pretty much immediately, as you go to the impact crater's entrance and find a device in the middle of the chamber. Once things start happening, you realise you have to look around for 11 more of these things. These Chozo artifacts are designed to be tricky to find, often requiring other items in order to reach them, and realistically, you need every main pickup in order to be able to accrue every single one of them, but there are a couple things that help at least. As an example, the lifts in the impact crater entrance carry scannable hints to the locations of each artifact, provided you've gained access to the region that they're located in. For example, if you haven't reached the phase on mines yet, you won't get the clues for the artifacts there. There's one problem here, and it's the same as the boss problem. Because this version of the game is in Japanese, you have to be able to make out certain things in the text and determine the different things it wants you to find. That's not the only problem, however. I remember the first few times I played through this game, even as late as my Let's Play a few years ago of the Metroid Prime Trilogy version, and I had no idea of where to find some of the artifacts, even with the clues the game gave me. I don't know whether to blame my own stupidity or to blame the game's instructional vagueness. I didn't feel like the game gave me enough breadcrumbs to go off of to find the artifacts, leading to me having to look online for the specific rooms the artifacts were in and the requirements for getting them. However, it can't have been that much of an impediment in reality, because having played this version twice, the first time being a few months ago when I got it, I managed to find the artifacts with relatively little issue, even with not that much memory of where many of them were. I was even able to make out bits and pieces of the clues to work out where I needed to go to find the artifacts that I was missing. In retrospect, I don't dislike this section of the game in the way that I once used to, especially because you can do this section of the game with relatively little issue as you progress through the game, dropping on them naturally without having to go out of your way to find them. The audio cues also help you in finding these artifacts and other items, but there is one thing I still think about this game. I do think this part of the game is largely unnecessary. I sometimes complain about this game aping Super Metroid a lot, such as with the music in places as well as the somewhat safe and familiar pickups. But in this respect, I think it could probably have aped a bit more by making it so that you had to defeat the certain bosses, rather than collecting keys around the place. I will say, talking about the final boss at the end within the impact crater, it feels slightly incomplete. I love the actual boss fight, and I think it makes pretty good use of what you've learned up to that point, but I almost can't help but think there is something that's missing here. Having said that, defeating the horrifically evolved carapaced form of a Metroid, naturally called Metroid Prime, feels like a challenge, a proper apex for this game, and I do think that there's quite a bit to like in this battle. Once you've defeated Metroid Prime's head, it mutates further and steals the Phazon suit from your body, taking it for itself and expanding rapidly, leaving you to escape the crater. Originally, this part of the game was intended to have an escape sequence, an old Metroid tradition. I assume development time constraints prevented that from happening, however. No matter, because in this instance, the end of the game sees Samus returning to her craft outside the impact crater entrance. Narration plays out, explaining Samus's journey was only just starting, and credits. There is a post-credits scene, however, which requires you picking up every single item the game has to offer, so if you wanted to go down that route, you absolutely could. I'm not that much of a hoarder, however, so I don't bother, but boy howdy, there's more to come. For now though, it's time to wrap this review up. 2002 was a pretty good year for gaming, huh? Especially if you were on the GameCube, which I wasn't, but nonetheless, to be able to go back and play through one of the games that led the charge for Nintendo's output again was quite the pleasure. When you think 2002 and the GameCube, you'll probably think of a fair few games. The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, Super Mario Sunshine, Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem, the Resident Evil remake. Personally, I think Metroid Prime. It nailed the atmosphere that the series was known for up to that point, and the transition from 2D to 3D was far smoother than probably anybody expected, with additional features that made good on the shift of perspective from the usual side-scrolling fare to something more akin to a first-person shooter. Although it isn't my favourite in the franchise, it is a game that is the favourite of a lot of people who are fans of the franchise, and for a lot of good reasons. It has great atmosphere, great gameplay, great music, and a lot of stuff to sink your teeth into. I do feel a little disappointed by the bosses and the artifact hunt, but although I don't think they're great, at the very least they aren't so bad that they knock it down much. I do find myself preferring a couple other games in the series though. Before I go into that, I must mention the Metroid Prime trilogy, and more specifically the new Play Control version of Metroid Prime that was made available for the Wii in 2009. For a catch-up, New Play Control was a line of GameCube games that were re-released for the Wii, with a control scheme designed for the Wii remote, as well as a few other features such as a bump to widescreen. In the case of Metroid Prime, the structure was in place for what to do with the game, courtesy of 2007's Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. It makes use of an aiming system where you aim your Wii remote towards the TV so Samus can look around smoothly. The system was applied to Metroid Prime with a lot of other changes, including the game being in widescreen now, as well as a few quality of life changes, such as flicking the Wii remote to jump in Morph Ball mode without the need to use bombs. For as long as the Wii U store is open, I would strongly recommend picking up Metroid Prime Trilogy if you can, simply because it's arguably the best way to play the games, and it's also probably the cheapest at this point, owing to the cost of physical copies for this whole series. I was fortunate to pick up a physical copy of Metroid Prime Trilogy a few years ago in a nearby game, where I picked it up for £50, knowing that I had no real other chance of seeing it cheaper than that. In fact, in a retro games market I was at, someone wanted over £100 for a copy. For now though, GameCube game prices have been going up for a little while, although Metroid Prime is still one that doesn't seem to have changed a great deal, being somewhere in the region of £10 to £30 for the PAL release based on condition. NTSC-J copies, however, only really start at £30 and work their way up to something absurd after a while for a couple reasons. The NTSC-J version is actually somewhat hard to find, as it didn't sell especially well owing to first-person games not historically being popular there. Because of that, don't be surprised if you start seeing copies of it in the hundreds of pounds or dollars. I was able to pick up Prime and Prime 2 for about £50 combined, which is very fortunate. I'm not going to recommend the place I ordered them from, however, for the simple reason that it was proving a bit of a pain to actually get anything from that place. Don't be too surprised therefore if the game is difficult to actually get if you want the NTSC-J release. The NTSC and PAL releases are better if you just want to play them, or the Wii U Store's Trilogy release because they're at least comparatively cheap. If you were to get the NTSC-J release, are there any language problems you might need to keep in mind? Well, yes. A fair few problems in fact. Don't be fooled by this game having an option in the settings menu to change the language between English and Japanese. as this only really changes the text on the heads-up display and not actually using English for anything you might want. Virtually all of the text in this game is Japanese, and thus you are going to need at least a basic understanding of Japanese if you want to have an idea of the plot of the game and what you need to do to defeat the certain bosses. If you care about that and can't read Japanese, don't bother. I've basically made an accidentally good case of not getting this version of the game. With that being said though, I can absolutely attest to this game being worth getting whichever way you see fit. It's a fantastic example of a game that transitioned a franchise from its two-dimensional roots to the third dimension, and it did so without going so far as to be unrecognisable as Metroid. Metroid Prime is perhaps the archetypal Metroid game. However, this was only the start of a series of games, and indeed it introduced a new element to Metroid that sees exploration in the later games. In fact, 2 more mainline games were made, with an extra game being made for the Nintendo DS. But that's not important right now. We'll get to the next game next time out. Anyway, that's Metroid Prime. A fantastic game with only a couple gripes that honestly are mostly minor and don't do enough to detract from the game as a whole. It does mean though that I have games in the series that I happen to prefer. If you have any recommendations on what I ought to cover for this series, please let me know, as I would be massively interested in expanding my collection. Speaking of, you can go to my website in the description down below to have a look at what I have in the collection so far, as well as what I have in my wishlist. And there is also my Twitter in the description to keep up to date with everything that I'm up to. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. City.
Bunk!